Wonderful. All right, so my name is Micah Streiffer. I know many of you from classes that we've taken together. Welcome to those who are new, and welcome back to those who've been part of L'cha Dodi before. I am the founder of L'cha Dodi, which is a Beit Midrash, a center for Jewish learning whose mission is to help liberal Jews connect with and deepen our connection with Judaism through study. I'm going to share my screen right now so that we can say together the blessing for study. Are you all seeing my screen now?
Yeah.
Great. What you're seeing now, that's actually the L'cha Dodi website. But let's go over to the blessing. If you'd like to join me, you can. You can even unmute yourself and just step back a little bit from your microphone so that we can hear each other and hear each other say this blessing together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the one, the eternal source of the universe, who helps make our lives holy with commandments and who commands us to engage in or immerse in words of Torah. The word la'asok, which is highlighted here in both languages, means to engage or to immerse. And of course, that's what we do when we study words of Torah. We engage or immerse. And that's why the name of our organization, the name of our center is called L'cha Dodi, because the purpose is to really dig into Jewish learning and Jewish texts and to make connections and to make meaning for ourselves. So we're here today to talk about L'cha Dodi. Now, I called the class Shabbat, Sexuality, and Redemption. We're going to find some of the surprising meanings within L'cha Dodi. But when you think about L'cha Dodi, for those who know it, you probably think about Friday night services, and you may have a favorite melody or two for this song. The funny thing about L'cha Dodi is that it is so versatile. The meaning of the song, as we'll see in a moment, has very little to do with the feeling of singing it on Friday night, because of course the melody could be anything from the traditional L'cha Dodi likrat kala b'nei Shabbat nekabela. I see some nodding, right? Some people remember that one from the 50s. Or just kidding, not all of us were around in the 50s, but some were. The sort of more traditional, maybe Hasidisha, L'cha Dodi likrat kala yalalai 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 b'nei Shabbat nekabela. I learned that one in Jerusalem years ago, down to the much more plaintive, slower L'cha Dodi, I. That's one of my favorites because I think it lends itself to that sort of meditativeness of a Friday night. Or what I like to call here in Canada, the Rabbi Leonard Cohen version of L'cha Dodi, which is the Hallelujah. L'cha Dodi likrat kala b'nei Shabbat. Or down to something like what I think they do at Jazz Fest weekend, where I come from in New Orleans, which sounds kind of like this. L'cha Dodi likrat kala b'nei Shabbat nekabela. So what is this song then? That it's a bit of a spiritual chameleon. We sing it to 1,000 melodies. Sometimes it makes us happy. Sometimes it brings us down. Sometimes it's meditative. Sometimes it's downright kitschy. I once heard L'cha Dodi sung to the song of the Irish protest song Tub Thumping. You know, I get knocked down, but I get up again. So like we can sing this to any melody. And yet our purpose today is to really dig into the meaning of the words. So L'cha Dodi really hinges around these words right here. I'm going to put on your screen. L'cha Dodi likrat kala b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Come, beloved, let us greet the bride. Let us welcome Shabbat. So already in these words of the chorus of L'cha Dodi, we see the notion of greeting. The Hebrew word kabel panim literally means to welcome the face. We translate that as to welcome. So we are literally welcoming the face of Shabbat. And so already we have a sense that Shabbat is not only something, but someone, something that has a face, that is worth welcoming, that enters the world, that enters into our lives on Friday night. And of course, as you know from this language, and as you probably know from, you might know from having heard the song or studied the song before, we often personify L'cha Dodi as a bride. And this word kala, of course, means bride. So these are two different artist renderings of the idea of Shabbat as a bride. On the right, you see the one by Melanie Lewis, and on the left by Ben Avram, two contemporary Jewish artists, very, very different renderings of this notion, but similarly, both of them with a notion that Shabbat is someone that we are welcoming, that brings something special, something unique into the world. So we're here to figure out what is the something special, something unique that's being brought into the world as we're singing L'cha Dodi on Friday night as the sun is going down. And I'll start with a story. Years ago, I was in Israel. This is maybe about, I don't know, maybe something like 12, 13 years ago, I was in Israel. And I was praying at a minyan, a service that I used to pray at regularly, as this beautiful, very spiritual, very musical little group of people who get together every Friday night to welcome Shabbat and to pray a service together. And as I sometimes do, I had my eyes closed. I was getting really into L'cha Dodi. The room was pretty full, and I'm singing through all the melodies, and I know the words, so I don't have to open my eyes to look at the words. And as we reached the end of L'cha Dodi, or toward the end of L'cha Dodi, I opened my eyes, and the room looked more empty than it had been. So I closed my eyes again, and we keep singing L'cha Dodi, and I swear this is true. I opened my eyes again, and there are fewer people in the room, and I'm wondering, what is going on here? By the end of L'cha Dodi, the room had almost entirely emptied out, and I'm looking around thinking, where is everybody? Why did they leave me alone in here to sing this song? At which point I realized that people had gone out of the room and outside to face the setting sun, to welcome Shabbat with the words of L'cha Dodi. So L'cha Dodi is literally a moment of welcoming, literally a moment of helping someone or something enter into the world. Now, here before you, you have, where is it? How do I do this? The entire, oh, that's way too big. The entire set of words of L'cha Dodi. Now, I know this is a lot to throw at you all at once, but I want to give you just a couple of minutes to look through these words and to tell me what it brings up for you. What is L'cha Dodi about? And what jumps out at you? So I'm going to give you like 3-4 minutes in silence to read through. And then if you'd like to share something that this raises up for you, or something that it makes you think about, you can go ahead and raise your hand electronically, and I'll call in a couple of people. Let's be commentators right now and write a little bit of oral commentary together on the words of this song. Oh, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry. Okay, now you've got the whole thing on one page. And if you want to share something, then either raise your hand electronically if you can, or just wave at me like this. And Stacy, I see you. You're first. We'll just give people another minute or so to read. All right, so let's see what this raises up for you. Stacy, go ahead. And Stacy, you're muted.
I learned this at some point. It's not, I can't give it credit to my own brain that I thought of it just now reading over this, but it really comes through. The idea that it's when we say we're welcoming the bride, it's the marriage of Chokhmah and Binah, which brings Da'at.
Yeah, so there's this mystical element of this Kabbalistic element of L'cha Dodi that we're actually going to get into. And I'm glad you used the word marriage, because of course marriage is a really important euphemism, or a really important metaphor that's being used here. Robert's comment in the chat: peace and light, stay woke. Robert, any chance you can tell us a little more what you mean by that? I know you're trying to be safe.
I was just getting that from the lines wake up, which is like be woke, and there was allusions to illumination and peacefulness.
Great. Yeah. So okay, so it literally says wake up, right? Here in verse 5, wake up, wake up. So the question of what does it mean to wake up, and who are we waking, and what does it mean that we're calling on something or someone to awaken as Shabbat is beginning? And then this idea of peace and light, I think you see a lot of language in this L'cha Dodi of peace, of light, maybe even language that borders on redemption, right? Dot, go ahead.
Thanks. It's also interesting. There's a lot of like female men, like terminology here, like she, bride, her. So it's interesting that it's like there's a lot of references to like those, like that kind of that gender, like female. And I wonder if it's because it's related to creation, like God's creation, and then female is always like part, like referenced as creation. So it's interesting, like there's that kind of reference in L'cha Dodi. It's like it's so female, while like in Torah we always say like he, because we always reference God as like him, and there's a lot of Torah where it's like there's a lot of male references. But here in L'cha Dodi it's like always a female reference here, which is quite interesting.
Great point. And in the Hebrew it's actually even more clear, because the words like hitoreri, which means wake up here in verse 5, that's a feminine, what's the word? Command form, like wake up, being spoken to a woman, right? Hitna'ari is the same here. So you see in verse 9 is really where it really comes to fruition here, where it's clearly being spoken in the feminine, right? So it is quite feminine language throughout this verse. I see Lauren, and then I see Margot.
Rabbi, I was wondering, when was this written historically? Because it seems to me that this was at the end of possibly an extended conflict, because it seems to be a piece of hope, and there's a tremendous amount of hope, but it also comes from a time when there was maybe defeat or subjugation. So I was just wondering when chronologically this has been sourced to.
Great. So I'm going to answer that in just a couple minutes. I mean, the short answer is that this is 500 years old or so, but that it references, or a lot of the language in it is much older than that. But I'm actually in just a moment going to show you exactly who wrote it and when. And the point you make is a really important one, that it references something that sounds like conflict or defeat or exile, and somehow sounds like redemption from that conflict, right? Like the end of it, or the hope of the possibility of the end of it. I think hope is a really important word here. Margot, go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually going to say more align with what Lauren just shared, and with what you, Rabbi, just extended and extrapolated. So I'm just going to put my hand down at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm hearing from people language here of waking up that you noticed. The idea of shaking it all off. Look at verse 4. Shake it all off, rise from the dust. It sounds like someone who's been down in the dust for quite a while, right? And now it's time to get up. You have language of royalty, city of royalty. Look at here in verse 4. Anybody know who Jesse, the son of Jesse of Bethlehem is? Anybody?
References to the Messiah, the lineage of the kingship.
Right. The
It's
son
David.
of Jesse is King David, right? King David is the son of Jesse, and the descendant of King David in traditional language is the Messiah. And you see that twice because King David is a descendant of Jesse here in verse 4,
Parrots
and also a
also.
descendant of Peretz. Thank you, Margot. Yeah. In here in verse 8, right? So we have here what you might call quasi and maybe not even quasi messianic language, right? A direct reference to the descendant of David, which is the traditional Jewish language of the Messiah. So we notice language that was feminine. We notice language about marriage. And I'm going to go further to argue that actually some of the language here is quite sexual, even though it might not be exactly clear on the surface, but we'll see how. Language of redemption and messianism, language that sounds like coming out of a long period of oppression or exile, right? And all of this as we're beginning L'cha Dodi. Lauren asked a question, which is, when was this written? I want to ask a different question, which is, who wrote this? Anybody know who wrote L'cha Dodi? So L'cha Dodi actually tells us who wrote it. The author left a hint of who wrote it here in the first
Is it an
letter
acrostic?
of each verse, right? L'cha Dodi is an acrostic. So look, I made them bold. You see here, Shin, Lamed, Mem, Hey, Shlomo, Hey, Lamed, Vav, Yud, Ha, Levi. So who is Shlomo HaLevi? This guy, brilliant guy, wrote the song in his own name so that we would always know who had left behind this beautiful poem. Shlomo HaLevi is Shlomo HaLevi Alkabetz. We unfortunately don't have a picture of him, but we do have pictures of his students. But this is his grave, which is located in the city of Sfat in northern Israel. Shlomo HaLevi Alkabetz was born, do I not have his dates here? Yes, okay. Born in 1500. He died around 1575. I guess I don't have his death date here. But Shlomo HaLevi Alkabetz is a Sephardic rabbi born in the city of Salonika, which is in Greece, in the year 1500. Now, what is significant about this time period, 1490s, 1500, especially with regard to the Sephardic Jewish community?
Exile.
Exactly. You're only 8 years here after what we call in Hebrew Gerush Sfarad, the expulsion from Spain. You know, in 1492, not only did Columbus sail the ocean blue, but all the Jews were kicked out of Spain too, right? That's how the rhyme ends. So in 1492, this extraordinarily traumatic event of the centuries-old Jewish community of Spain being expelled as the Christians consolidate power over Spain, and they launch the Inquisition in order to both find all the false Christians and make sure that everybody is towing the line. So Jews have an option in 1492, which is to either convert, leave, or die. And Jews did all three of those things. Many converted. Many of them sort of falsely converted. They became known as conversos, which were the new Christians that often, or sometimes at least, then later left Spain and reclaimed their Jewish heritage. Many died in the Inquisition and in persecution by Christians, and many, many left. Sephardic Jews spread all around the Mediterranean basin. They built a huge community in Amsterdam, which is where Baruch Spinoza comes from. They built Jewish communities in places like Turkey, Greece, a little bit of Italy, North Africa, and ultimately in the land of Israel as well. So the Sephardic Jewish community finds its way around Europe and carries its creativity, its learning, and its trauma with it all over the Mediterranean area. Rabbi Shlomo HaLevi Alkabetz was born 8 years after that. He also studied under one of the most important Jewish mystical teachers of that time period, Rabbi Yosef I don't even know how to say his last name, Taitachak or something like that. And you'll note Rav Yosef, 1465 to 1546, born in Spain and therefore expelled from Spain. So we're talking about the immediate generation of the Spanish exile. And this generation was maybe not surprisingly, became deeply immersed in Jewish mysticism. This is the time of the rise of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is in many ways a response to the trauma, because it becomes a way for Jews to be able to become close to God, to respond to exile and trauma, while in a positive way, which is to say, we just had to leave behind our home of 1,000 years. We might have believed that God had abandoned us, but instead we doubled down on the notion that God is here with us, that God comes into exile with us, which is one of the central notions of Kabbalah that the Kabbalists get from the Talmud, but really make their own after the Spanish expulsion. Rabbi Shlomo Halevi lives for a while in Adrianople, Turkey. He wrote a number of works there. He was relatively prolific, although the thing he's known best for is L'cha Dodi. He arrived in 1535 in the city of Tzfat. Tzfat there's a little map down here. Here's what Tzfat looks like. Anybody ever been to Tzfat in northern Israel? Gorgeous city. You need to visit Tzfat. I see one person has. Situated on a hilltop, as you can see here, overlooking the valleys of the northern Galilee. Tzfat was considered one of the 4 holy cities by the Jews during this time period, and they are Tzfat, Tiberias, Jerusalem, and Hebron, all historical Jewish cities, places where, that have historically been important and holy for Jews. And Tzfat, for whatever reason, becomes a kind of a center for Jewish mysticism during this time, during this 16th century. So Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz settles in Tzfat, and he finds there a budding Jewish mystical community in which he becomes known as a rabbi and a teacher. Some of his most important students, people that you may have heard of, include Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who is a great Kabbalist, and he is the teacher of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, creator of Lurianic Kabbalah. The idea of the sparks embedded in all matter, the idea of tikkun olam, repairing the world by doing mitzvot and by releasing sparks of divinity back to God. That's Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. So we're talking about the teacher, of the person who created that world-changing idea. Rabbi Yosef Karo, who's the creator or who's the adapter of the Shulchan Aruch, the most important Jewish law code to this day, also a student of Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz. So we don't have any pictures of him. We have some of his works, but we know how influential and important he must have been because he taught some of the most important Jewish teachers of his time. But what he's best known for is composing L'cha Dodi. So the idea behind L'cha Dodi, remember, is that we are welcoming somebody, welcoming something. L'cha Dodi may very well have been inspired by this view. This is the view to the west, looking down the mountain from Tzfat. If you were sitting there, you might be inspired to write a song also, right? If you've ever sat there, it's one of the most beautiful places, I believe, on earth, especially as the sun is setting. So here, this is the same spot down here. Oh, oops. This isn't going all that well. Come on. This is the same spot right here. It's been sort of beautified with beautiful stones. Those are my kids. That's 9 years ago in the spot where I believe this is the spot where L'cha Dodi was, if not written, then inspired. Because this is the spot from which you can see that beautiful sunset on the slopes of the city of Tzfat. So the Jews here are living in northern Israel. They're living in one of these 4 holy cities, and they're promulgating a new Jewish idea about what it is to mystically come into contact with God. Jewish mysticism involves the notion that people can come into contact with the divine. In Hebrew, we call it dvekut, which means clinging to God, as well as an intense belief that the redemption of the world is possible. Well, that's a really important idea coming from a group of people who had just been expelled from their home, from the home they had known for hundreds and hundreds of years. Out of that, they carried the idea that it actually was possible to redeem the world. And they began to view Shabbat as a taste of that redemption. So the song that he wrote, and that then became, in many ways, the most important song of the Friday night service, is based on some ideas we'll find in the Talmud. This is Talmud Tractate Shabbat, pages 118 through 119. There's a lot here. We're going to kind of race through, but I want you to get a sense of what's going on here. So this is 1,000 years before Tzfat, before Rabbi Shlomo Halevi. This is what the rabbis have to say about Shabbat in the, let's call it like the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yossi, one who delights in Shabbat, God gives that person a boundless portion, which is to say, God gives you a reward if you delight in Shabbat. And they go through, I'm not going to read all this, but they go through and they say it's not the reward of Abraham who, or Isaac who were confined within the land of Israel. It's the reward of Jacob, about whom it says, your reward will be to the north, the south, the east, and the west. So this idea that observing Shabbat brings along with it some kind of portion, some kind of reward for its observance. But the rabbis go further. Rabbi Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, one who delights in Shabbat is rescued from the oppression of exile. As it is written with regard to Shabbat in Isaiah, and I will cause you to ride to the heights, the bamotei of the world when you observe Shabbat. And it is written there in Deuteronomy that you will trample their bamotemo, their high places. And the high places here are the high places of the enemies who are oppressing you. So the rabbis take these two ideas and they say observing Shabbat somehow brings along with it a rescue, a redemption from oppression in exile. Let me ask you a question. Why would the rabbis of, call it the 5th or 6th century, want to associate Shabbat with redemption from exile? Stacy, go ahead. And Stacy, you're muted.
I have a button on my headphones, so I press that one, but I also have to press this one, so every time I forget. Well, they had just gone through, this horrible experience of exile, and Shabbat is, transcendental. When we get together to celebrate Shabbat, we are invoking the divine essence, and they would be feeling themselves steeping in that, especially in the circumstances of looking at that gorgeous view and ending up in Eretz Yisrael after having been exiled.
Great. Yeah, it's a reminder to us of how much exile has been a part of the Jewish experience from the beginning. Because when we look at the Talmud here, now we're looking at Babylonia in the 6th century, and we're looking at a whole different exile, right? A group of people who have some kind of a vague memory of their having been exiled from the land of Israel in the 1st or 2nd century, right? The temple being destroyed. Jewish life has so often had exile at the center of it. And Shabbat, which in the Torah is what we call a zikaron l'ma'aseh bereshit, a reminder of the work of creation, is also a zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim, a reminder of the exodus from Egypt, which is, of course, being freed from exile and oppression. And so Shabbat has always carried with it the notion of being freed from exile, of being redeemed from exile. And the rabbis in this passage in the Talmud seem to believe that if you observe Shabbat, you will be rescued from exile. Now, there's two possibilities for what that means. One possibility is the more we observe Shabbat, the sooner God will bring the Messiah, which is to say, if we keep observing Shabbat, if we keep doing mitzvot, God will bring the Messiah sooner. So let's make sure we celebrate Shabbat, guys. And it says a version of that in the Talmud. The other possibility for what this means is something much more mystical. And this, I think, is what Stacy was hinting at, something much more individual and transcendental, which is to say that when I observe Shabbat, I am freed from the oppression of exile, that Shabbat somehow brings a measure of redemption into my life. Which one of those two do you think the rabbis mean? And it's a trick question, I'll tell you. I think they mean both at the same time. I didn't even give you a chance to answer, sorry. I think they mean both at the same time. I think the rabbis believed that when one observes Shabbat, then they have the power to help God bring the Messiah a little sooner. Now, I don't know if I literally believe that, literally agree with that. Although I think the Chabadniks who stand outside my grocery store and offer people to put on tefillin do hold a belief like that, that the more of us who are engaged in Jewish ritual, the more of us doing mitzvot, the sooner we redeem the world. And I think that the rabbis believed a version of that. I think they also believed, because how could they possibly not have experienced it this way, that Shabbat is in and of itself redemptive. That is to say that the act of observing Shabbat brings a measure of redemption into the world. So the rabbis say you gotta honor Shabbat. Honoring Shabbat is a way to bring redemption. How do you honor Shabbat? What is this honoring of Shabbat? I love this paragraph. With what does one delight in the day of Shabbat? Rabbi Yehuda, son of Rav Shmuel bar Shilat, said in the name of Rav, with a dish of beets and a large fish and heads of garlic. In other words, nice food, like celebratory food. I guess those are celebratory foods in ancient Babylonia. Rav Chia bar Ashi said that Rav said, even with regard to a small item and one prepared in deference, it is a delight. And the Gemara said, what is a small item mentioned? Rav Papa said, small fried fish. In other words, you can take little things and you can make them big, make them beautiful by preparing them thoughtfully for Shabbat. So, okay, that's one possibility for how to make Shabbat holy. You take ordinary foods and you make them special. I'm going to show you another way, and this will lead us more directly to L'cha Dodi. But before that, Stacy, go ahead.
I just still had my hand up. My bad.
Oh, okay, no worries. So there's a whole bunch of Gemara here that, I'll email this out to you later. You can look at it. But there's another opinion here for how one honors Shabbat. And this is right here down at the bottom of the page. Rabbi Hanina would wrap himself and stand at nightfall on Shabbat Eve and say, come and we will go out to greet Shabbat the Queen. Rabbi Yanai would put on his garment on Shabbat Eve and say, Boi chala, enter, O bride, enter, O bride. Why do you suppose that the rabbis are dressing Shabbat in this kind of language, the language of queen, the language of bride? Any thoughts on that? Yes, Margot. You're muted, Marco. We can't hear you.
I keep putting it on mute so I don't disturb anyone. I don't know about the queenship, but on the Shabbat, it's special mitzvah when husband and wife come together. And so I think there might be some type of a mystical elevation happening with reference to Shabbat being, I suppose, representative of God, and we, God's people, coming together.
I think that I think that's where it ends up. I think in the beginning it's even simpler than that. That is to say, what is more beautiful? What is more hopeful, and what is more exciting than the moment in which a bride enters, right? It's this beautiful moment filled with hope and beauty. And I think the rabbis are thinking of it in that way. And that, Margot, as you point out, leads to all these other ideas about, the Shabbat being the union of the various elements of God. And I think what the rabbis here
and
are doing.
that's also one of the charities or acts of chesed, is providing for a bride, isn't it?
Yes, it most definitely is, right? And I think the rabbis here are reaching for the most beautiful metaphor they can find. And the metaphor that they find is the metaphor of a bride or a queen entering the room. And it's a metaphor both of beauty and honor, right? What do you do when the bride enters? You stand up, right? And the bride enters, you ooh and ah. And I want to recognize that this is incredibly heteronormative, all of this, right? I think that, and that's in a way goes without saying, but I want to recognize that. But this is, this has been part of our tradition for quite a long time. And so the rabbis want to ooh and ah over Shabbat as they do in that beautiful, hopeful moment. Lauren, go ahead.
Would it be that this marriage is a marriage of acceptance of of Judaism itself, that maybe this was a way to integrate the poetry of what the piece was all about and what it was to accept their concept of Judaism?
I'm not sure I understand.
It promoted the Jewish belief, the Jewish religion, the Jewish way, and the laws and the traditions of Judaism, and that was what they were celebrating. There were the Israelite people were becoming part of the marriage to the religion. Is that
Yeah, I mean, I think
true?
in a way, if I understand what you're saying, I think it beautifies it. And I think it involves people, right? This isn't just something that's happening to us. It's something that we're involved in, right? In a way, if you look at the words of L'cha Dodi, come Dodi, my beloved, and let us welcome Shabbat. Who are we in that? We are actually we're the ones escorting the bride, right? So we're present at the wedding, and we'll get more deeply into that in just a moment. Stacy, go ahead, and then I want to actually jump back another 1,000 years.
Very cool. So whenever I see things that may be interpreted as sexual inside of, ancient writings like these, I think about how these, mostly men, or probably entirely men, would have been relating to the idea of sex. I think about the idea of, God's aspect of wisdom and God's aspect of understanding. Literally, they describe it as though they are literally having intercourse, and when it's talked about here, it feels like they're sort of drawing a reference to an aspect of their humanity that feels powerful and almost beyond their control.
Yes, I think so too. I think it's worth note. That's a really important point, that marriage, as the rabbis understand it, is an unequal contract, right? A contract in which I've just been reading Rachel Adler's book, Engendering Judaism, and she talks about this, that marriage in Judaism is essentially a contract between unequals. The man is more powerful than the woman, and so and God is the powerful being in this metaphor that they're creating. And I think the rabbis are understanding the marriage as a moment of hope, and a moment of hope in a world where we sometimes feel powerless, right? I think the reason marriage is such an important metaphor is that it's a moment of hopefulness, hope of redemption, hope for the future. Every moment of marriage is a moment of optimism, where you can look forward to what is coming, what this couple will build together. And I believe that it's that hope and that optimism that's being referenced here. And in the end, what the rabbis do is they give us the metaphor, they give us the resonance of Shabbat as resonance of redemption, right? We saw that in the Talmud. We saw Shabbat as a guest to be honored, and specifically a bride or a queen, someone to be honored. So Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz is sitting in Tzfat 1,000 years later, wanting to welcome Shabbat with beauty and honor, and with messianic fervor and longing for redemption, having just experienced expulsion. He reaches back into the Talmud and he grabs this metaphor of Shabbat as a bride, and he combines it with a metaphor, or with language that's even older than that. He reaches back another 1,000 years before that to the book of Isaiah. I'm going to go forward here. This is moving more slowly than I wanted it to. Okay. Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, is actually divided into 2 and maybe 3 sections. The last, let's call it about 15 chapters of the book of Isaiah, are not written by the same hand as the prophet Isaiah. They are written by someone who lived during the Babylonian exile. someone who was an anonymous writer who was probably exiled from Babylonia and who was participating both in the project of helping keep the Jews afloat during exile, and also of the project of helping return to the Jews back to Zion after 70 years of exile. And the prophet Isaiah, or the writer Deutero-Isaiah, writes a series of messages of comfort. Now, some of these might be familiar to you because we read them as haftarah, pretty much starting next week and through Rosh Hashanah. From Tisha B'Av, which is the date of the destruction of the temple, through Rosh Hashanah, we read a series of haftarot, first of admonition, where we are admonished for our actions, for our sins and our wrongdoing, and then of comfort, where God reminds us over and over and over again that we are still in covenant, that God will redeem us, that things will be better, and that we will rise from the dust, and specifically Jerusalem will rise from the dust. So Isaiah writes, I'm here at the top of the page, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Comfort, O comfort, or be comforted, my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and declare to her that her term of service is over, which is to say, her time of exile is over. And then he launches into language that might sound familiar to you. In Isaiah 40, he writes, the glory of the eternal shall be revealed, Nigla kavod Adonai, which is identical to verse 5 of L'cha Dodi. Kavod Adonai alayich nigla. Here in Isaiah 51, he writes, Hitoreri, kumi Yerushalayim. Oh, wake up, stand up, O Jerusalem. And then in a chapter later, Hitna'ari me'afar kumi. Shake off the dust and arise, O Jerusalem. Another chapter later, Ki yamin usmol tifrot, you will spread out to the right and to the left. And then finally, in another chapter later, Lo tevoshi velo tikalmi, you shall not be ashamed, and you shall not be forced to cringe or to moan. These words, Shlomo Alkabetz lifts wholesale and drops into the poem that he's writing. In other words, he seized on what are probably the oldest words of redemption in the entire Jewish tradition, the one writer who is writing words of hope during the exile with the belief that the Jews can return to the land and that Jerusalem can be rebuilt. And Shlomo Halevi, sitting in Tzfat in 1500 or so, takes these words and writes them into a song that is a song of redemption. So when we sing L'cha Dodi, we're actually singing these ancient words, which say essentially, the world can be redeemed. We believe that the current exile, that the oppression of our people, that the brokenness of the world actually can be different than it can be, that the world can awaken and stand up, that the world can shake off its dust, that hope can spread out to the right and to the left, that we can no longer be shamed and no longer have to cringe. In other words, with every Shabbat, we renew our hope in the possibility of redemption. That in and of itself is amazing and beautiful, that we would sing that every Friday night, that Shabbat is the symbol of that. But what's mystical about it? What's mystical about it, and Stacy has referenced this a couple of times, is that the rabbis believe that not only are we in exile, but a part of God is in exile. So this is from the Talmud, from Tractate Megillah 29. It is taught in a Baraita. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, come and see how beloved the Jewish people are to the Holy One. In every place they were exiled, the Holy One went with him. They were exiled to Egypt, and the divine presence with them. And then he quotes, went with them. Then he quotes a verse to prove it. They were exiled to Babylonia, and the divine presence went with them, as it is stated, etc., etc. They were exiled to whatever, in our current exile, the divine presence also comes with us. It says, it does not state he will bring back, God will bring back, but rather God will return. This teaches that the Holy One will return together with them from among the various exiles. So the rabbis believe that there is a portion of God that is in exile, that God has been somehow broken by the brokenness of the world. And the rabbis believe, and the mystics especially believe, that at the end, when the Messiah comes someday, when the world is repaired, God will also be repaired. And so now we have a different kind of wedding. Now we have a portion of God being reunited with a different portion of God. And the mystical and maybe even sexual union of these two parts of God coming back together, that's who we're escorting. L'cha Dodi likrat kala. Come, my beloved, and let us welcome the bride. We are escorting the elements of God's self back together so that the world can be redeemed, if only for the next 25 hours, if only for Shabbat. The brokenness of the world goes away, and the world is once again a place of wholeness and beauty and happiness. And what's the best metaphor you know for wholeness and beauty and happiness when all is well? Sex, of course, right? Love, of course. And so the language of L'cha Dodi is not only redemptive, it is also the language of love. Take a look at this from the Song of Songs, which is the Bible's love poem. Ani Dodi, I am my beloved's desire is for me. Those words might be familiar to some of you. And then in the next verse, verse 12, L'cha Dodi ne'tzeh hasadeh. Come, my beloved, let us go out into the field. Let us lodge among the henna shrubs. Let us go early to the vineyards. Let us see if the vine has flowered and the blossoms have opened, if the pomegranates are in bloom. There I will give my love to you. So Shlomo Alkabetz seizes on this ancient love poem, which contains the words L'cha Dodi. And he says, you know, the entering of Shabbat, the beginning of Shabbat, is a sexual experience. It is a love experience. It is an experience in which God is reunited with God's self, if you believe in that mystically speaking. It's an experience in which we are reunited with those we love. And somebody referenced the idea of double mitzvah in the chat. They're right, it's actually a mitzvah to make love on Shabbat, because Shabbat is meant to be a time of love. And so the song that we sing on Friday night as the bride enters is actually a song of love, a song about both the feelings of and the act of love. And by the way, that's also like a wedding, right? Like we all know what's happening after, that night later after the wedding, right? We all know that that sexuality and love are associated with weddings, at least in healthy relationships, at least when things are well, right? And so the rabbis, or the mystics, they pile all of this language of redemption and love into this poem, this song that they're singing on Friday nights. Now, the idea of Shabbat as being associated with love is also very, very old. Look at this passage from Genesis Rabbah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught that the Sabbath said to the Holy One, Master of the universe, every day has a mate. Sunday has Monday, Tuesday has Wednesday, Thursday has Friday, but I have no mate. Said the Holy One to her, it's interesting, her, Shabbat as a her here, Israel will be your mate. Thus, when Israel stood before Mount Sinai, the Holy One said to her, remember what I said to Shabbat, Israel will be your mate. Thus the command, remember the Sabbath day, to sanctify it, l'kadsho. And the word l'kadsho means both to sanctify and also to get married to. In other words, we get married to Shabbat every Friday night. Shabbat is like our bride. So this is happening on at least 3 levels, right? Because we have the wedding of God to God's self. We have the wedding of the people Israel to Shabbat, and then we have the love, the love making of human lovers on Friday night, as Shabbat becomes a time of ideally of love. And think about your Friday night dinner. I mean, you've got candles, you've got wine, you've got the best food, right? Friday night dinner, Shabbat dinner, is like a really nice candlelit romantic dinner, right? So none of this is accidental. Shabbat is meant to be a time in which we are at our happiest, and we are at our happiest when we are loving and we are feeling loved. And so the metaphors that get built into this L'cha Dodi are metaphors of love and of coming together in both the feelings and the act of love. And the rabbis see it as happening on several levels. As we mentioned before, that it's happening both on that human level and also on the divine level. And this is more explicitly what Stacy had referenced a couple times. This is a drawing of the 10 Sfirot, which is the mystical sort of map of what God looks like, so the various emanations of God. I'll send this out to you later so you don't, I know it's a little hard to see on your screen. The rabbis believe that God has various aspects and that these aspects all represent both different pieces of God's being and different emotional responses, different levels of holiness, different levels of our ability to connect with. And they say that, this is from Rabbi Josh Franklin, from a Kabbalistic view, here, I'm just the last, Zachor, which means to remember, represents the male, and the word Shamor represents Shekhinah, which is God's female attribute, also called Malchut. So you see here Tiferet, which is the one aspect, and Shekhinah, which is the other aspect. And on Shabbat, the two unite together, bringing about the offspring of redemption and holiness. In other words, what is the offspring? What is the progeny of God's reuniting, of God's being repaired, God's tikkun? It is the redemption and holiness of the entire world. So we have this redemption happening on both a cosmic level and the redemption happening on a sort of an individual level by means of people. Over the next 25 hours, I'm going to stop focusing on what's going on out there, and I'm going to focus on this relationship or these relationships that matter most to me. And in so doing, then we're able to bring a kind of a measure of redemption into the world. Shabbat is known as Me'en Olam Haba, a taste of the world to come, because Shabbat is supposed to be a time where we experience messianic redemption, that for just a short period of time, we experience the world as it's supposed to be. And I always say, it doesn't mean that your to-do lists won't be back on Saturday night, right? It doesn't mean that your taxes won't still be calling for you on Sunday. We will still have to do those things. But Shabbat helps us, I think, to practice for just a short period of time what it means to focus on the things that matter most. And that maybe redemption actually is not something that comes about when someone else redeems us, but rather something that comes about when we learn how to redeem ourselves, when we learn how to focus ourselves for just a little bit of time. So let me pause here. We've got a couple of minutes left, and just take any thoughts, questions, or reactions. And then I want to end with one last text about redemption and Shabbat. I see Stacy, then I see Margot.
I just wanted to say what a lovely thing this is to get to do as I welcome in Shabbat this week. What a great way to have my brain tuned in. I've always cared a lot about the deeper meaning of this song. And thank you for giving me some more insight.
I love that. Thank you, Stacy, and thanks for being here. Margot.
And I also wanted to concur that this has been a really instructive session, lots of layers that you've revealed. And I was wondering if we will be getting the source sheet, or it might have been posted. I was a couple minutes late, but there's lots of information here that I'd like to be able to review.
I
Yes.
can link
Thank
to
you so much.
I have a Google Doc where I've been screenshotting the slides. I can throw that link in the chat.
Thanks for that, Stacy. And I'm going to just email this out as a PDF afterwards. So you'll all
I'd
receive
love that.
this. Yeah, you'll
Thank
all
you so
receive
much.
this later. So let me end this by way of one final thought. This is from a text that I've been studying with my chavruta. This is called the Darchei Noam, which is Rabbi Shmuel Berezovsky, who's still living. He's the Slonomer Rebbe, the current, I think the 7th or 8th Slonomer Rebbe, lives in Israel. And this is from his book of Avodot, which is to say the work that we have to do to work on ourselves. And it's divided into like Shabbat and prayer and a bunch of different sections in terms of the work we have to do. This is from his section on prayer. Now, I didn't know this. I learned from this text that there is a traditional Friday night song that includes the words Shetarchameni od bigluti, God, have mercy on me even in my exile. I don't know this. It's not part of my liberal Jewish tradition, but at any rate, he's commenting on this idea that we're asking God for redemption in our exile. And here's what he says. He says, proper prayer is according to the language of I am prayer. In other words, when you pray properly, you become prayer, which is to say that in a moment of prayer, one becomes entirely prayer and possesses nothing in the world but it. What does it mean? How do you know you're in what he calls proper prayer? By the way, none of us have probably ever been in this in our entire lives, at least wholly, right? But in theory, how would you know you're in proper prayer? He says a sign of it is that if mixed into your prayers are outside thoughts and various matters, that shows you have not reached the status of I am prayer. So you know when you're in shul on Friday night and all of a sudden you think, oh shoot, I forgot to do that thing. Or, oh, I better make sure to take care of that. Or I'm worried about this or that. He says those are the things that distract us from being our prayers. And those are normal. We all experience those. But the goal of prayer is to enter into this place where you are entirely your prayer. He says that is why at the entrance of Shabbat, a Jew asks God to have mercy on me in my exile. He says, even if I have not yet merited complete redemption and I am decreed to remain in exile, nonetheless, I ask God for a mini redemption. So Shabbat is our opportunity to set aside all of those things and to experience redemption in some form. Newsflash, the Messiah is probably not coming by Sunday morning. You know, I hate to say it out loud, but the world can be redeemed. We do have the capacity to bring redemption into the world through focusing on what matters most to us. And that can be tikkun olam, repairing the world, bringing what we have to making the world a better place. And it can also be on focusing inward on our relationships and on the people that matter most to us. L'cha Dodi, I think, raises up that idea that on Shabbat, when we focus on what matters, it helps bring the world into a greater state of tikkun. Maybe even mystically speaking, it brings the pieces of God back together. But at any rate, that's the kind of mini redemption that we are capable of achieving on Shabbat. So with that, I'll wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom. I hope you have a weekend or a Shabbat of joy and maybe some love and also of redemption, at least mini redemption at the very least. Thanks everybody for being with me and take care.
Thanks, Rabbi. Shabbat
Thank